Today it's IT security, and there's so many ways to go here. Whether you're dealing with policy, dealing with staff, whether you're dealing with the network itself, whether you're dealing, well, Eric will tell us. He'll give us a good idea here, because what we want to do is sort of start off and do a basic audit of what we're doing and how we can improve it. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, well, let's start. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes, you are.
Okay,
There you are.
cool. Uh, so yeah, these few slides got triggered by a few emails back and forth with Barry. I suppose many talks do get triggered. And he asked a question, which I will come back to in a moment, and to Tim and I. And Tim, unfortunately, can't be here due to a family emergency. And we were kicking this around, and in some respects, we felt the question was the wrong question. And so that prompted this discussion of station security and perspective. And so
I will mention that we have Wayne Pacino with us too today, Eric, and
noticed,
he might just
yes,
sound in at some point.
you just want to make me really uncomfortable.
No, Wayne's a
Hi,
good guy.
Wayne. um, so I think if we wanted to step back and take a look at the big picture, we've wanted to say first thing to do is talk about relevant risks. And in this context, we're saying relevant risks are risks that threaten the goals for the station. Different stations have different goals, but they might be financial goals for a commercial station or a non-commercial station, and probably service to the community goals. Coming from a telephone and data networking background, I think about availability in terms of 459s. But there are also other service goals like response time to local events. And in many people's experiences, those are often poorly defined initially. Different people touch the elephant in different ways, to use the classic metaphor. And so oftentimes to identify those critical station goals, there needs to be a discussion to form a consensus, or someone has to take a decision as to what those goals are. And then once one has identified relative risks that threaten achieving those goals, we can start talking about assessing the impact of those risks. Risk assessment is a topic that's been discussed for a couple of hundred years, actually. And a very good philosophical handle on risk assessment is to divide risks into three categories. The first here being the most severe existential risk. An existential risk is one that is likely unrecoverable should that event occur. And it may mean that in the case of a station, it may mean that the business goes bankrupt, for example. In the case of a society, it may be that war kills off enough people that the nature of that society cannot survive, and that culture is lost. Catastrophic risks are one level less. They are extremely disruptive. They may involve lengthy recoveries, or they may be situations where recovery is limited. If an atomic bomb were dropped on New York City, that would be considered a catastrophic risk event. And the ability to restore New York City to what it was, it would be a lengthy process and probably limited. So that's an extreme example of what's considered catastrophic risk. Everything else is recoverable. It might take a while. It might be difficult to do. and those are important metrics to be aware of. But when one starts taking a look at risks to a business or an operation, the existential ones and the catastrophic ones are definitely ones that should command one's attention. Having identified risks to the goals of the station, in our case here, we can start to prioritize them in terms of impact. So we've talked about existential impact, catastrophic impact, and then a range of other impacts from large to small or minimal, and also frequency. So some events are rare, but catastrophic. There's a term for those. They're called black swans. But a lot of the things that we wind up focusing on are things that are more likely to happen and will have some kind of impact. So this gets me back into the prompt that came in my email box and Tim's email box back a while back, a couple of weeks ago. And Barry says, one thought, how to prevent weekenders from crashing the system. And in kicking this around a bit, my first reaction to that was preventing weekend employees, part-time employees from crashing one system is probably very low on the totem pole of risks that we need to spend time on. And here's why. If we look at impact of risks and we take a bigger picture, not just focusing on IT issues and machines, there are probably, for many stations, risks that have much more consequential impact on the ability of the station to meet its goals. If the owner dies or is incapacitated, if it's an AM station and they lose their AM tower site, these can be existential or catastrophic risks for the business. Utility failures can be risks that mean the station doesn't meet its service goals. And those can be seen as being much more important to address than an IT risk. Natural disasters, thefts, phishing, and malware. There's a long list of things, but some things will jump out as things that need to be addressed much sooner than others. And many of those things are not IT things. The other thing to pay attention to is that risks can combine, and the combination of two risk events occurring simultaneously may be far more serious to the business than each risk if it occurred individually. And when you see combinations like that, they should be evaluated separately from the individual risks. So I'll give one example here that occurred in the Boulder area. About 2 years ago, we had a wildfire go through the area on a day with very high winds, over 100 miles an hour. And it went through a space between Boulder and Denver and burnt about 1,100 homes and took out several hundred businesses. It was the most destructive wildfire to date in Colorado's history. So wildfire was a risk that we were aware of at the stations that I work and volunteer at. But what we didn't consider was the knock-on effects of a wildfire. So one of the knock-on effects of the wildfire was that the electric utility company started shutting down electric lines in the area of the fire and in areas that had high winds occurring, because electric lines that were weakened by high winds sometimes generate sparks, and that was not a condition under which you wanted to have sparks starting a wildfire. Which is fine. You know, if you have a cell site and you lose commercial power, you might switch over to a generator. And our one of the stations I work at, their main transmission site was in the path of the fire, and they had such a generator, and it ran on natural gas. Unfortunately, the utility that shuts off the electric power also shuts off the natural gas feeding into a wildfire area. So the generator facilities were not going to be available for this transmitter site, nor were they going to be available for many cell sites. And in addition, The route between Boulder and Denver has a rail line along it, and that is a major internet backbone for a number of internet carriers. So not only were cell sites being taken off the air and causing congestion on cellular telephone networks, but internet congestion was becoming a very serious problem because the backbone routes for these major ISPs, such as Comcast, were going dark. And they were either going dark because fibers themselves were being burnt, or the fiber repeating facilities were being burnt, or those facilities just didn't have electricity to power them. And that imposed quite a few problems in both the community as a large in terms of getting the word out to people about where the fire was going and who should be evacuating and what to do with things like large animals. But it also meant it was difficult for the station to do news gathering in that kind of environment. So these were three risks: utility outage, cellular network outage, and internet outage, and wildfire outage, that combined together to make life much more difficult than any one of those risks individually. And then to top it all off, we learned about something called smoke fade, which is if you have a wildfire and wildfire smoke gets in the path of your 950 megahertz SDL, you're going to have interruptions. Needless to say, it was a very educational day and a very stressful one. So that's why I wanted to emphasize combinations of risks. So once you've made this plot of risks that represent important threats to your business, you can actually take each of those risks or combinations and put them on this 2D graph space and start to talk about which ones to tackle first. So it's probably no surprise to you that the first things you want to tackle are risks that are likely to occur, and that would be catastrophic or existential problems for your business or have a big impact on your station's performance. So one example of that would be a utility failure. And when you compare that to the risk that a weekender comes in and does something to your IT systems, you might judge that taking care of utility failures and preparing to do something about them is more important than dealing with a weekender IT issue. The next step in this is to evaluate mitigations for risks that you're going to tackle. So if you've gone through this process more methodically than some people do, and you say, okay, fine, we're going to take a look at risks that fall in the first tier, what can we do to address them? And again, you have an opportunity of taking various mitigations and putting them in a different kind of 2D space shown here, which are things that are cheap and easy to do versus costly and difficult on one axis, and the efficacy of a risk mitigation, which can range from minimal to largely eliminating. So that in itself gives you a cluster of potential actions that you can take to mitigate risks of any kind, not just IT risks. And it gives you a tool to put mitigation strategies for IT risks in perspective with mitigation strategies for other risks that can affect the operation or business of a station. And again, you can pick the things to do first. So it stands to reason here that you're going to tackle first those things that are cheap and easy to do and largely eliminate the set of problems that you're trying to address in this pass. And then work your way down to dealing with others that might be more costly or a little bit more time consuming to do and maybe not 100% effective, but at least partially effective in addressing a problem. So I mentioned earlier malware, and malware can be introduced into IT systems by a variety of mechanisms. Someone clicking on a phishing email is one classic one, but someone who is a guest at the station or a DJ who brings in their own laptop computer with sound files that they want to play on their show could be also bringing in a virus or other form of malware that could be a problem if it gets introduced into the rest of the IT infrastructure. Both of those issues have approaches that can at least partially mitigate those risks. So when you come around to tackling those, you can look at things like training people not to click on emails, realizing that that's a cheap and easy approach, but it's not going to completely eliminate the problem. People do make mistakes, and they do get social engineered into making those mistakes. And similarly, you can decide whether putting into place network infrastructures that allow hosts to come in with their own laptops and plug them into some part of the station's internet could be done in a way that protects the rest of the station's internet from any malware that are on those devices that people bring in, the bring your own device risk. So again, here we're looking for ways of putting the cost, time, and effort for mitigation strategies into a kind of rough ranked order. You don't have to be terribly precise about this to decide what to invest your time and resources into. Many years ago, I was told that if somebody gives a talk like this, you are very fortunate if your audience remembers 3 points. So I'm going to summarize the 3 points that I would like you to remember from these few slides before opening it up to a more general discussion. And those are: only assess risks that threaten critical station goals. Everything else is probably irrelevant or noise, or you won't have time to address. The second step is to take risks or combinations of risk and make a rough judgment as to how likely they are to occur and what the impact would be, and focus on those things that are more likely and more consequential. And then third, for those things that you are focusing on, take a look at different mitigation possibilities and evaluate them by level of effort and efficacy. And again, focus on those things that are easier to do and more effective in mitigating the risk. But remember, there is one slight exception, that for those things that are the most consequential risks, there may be hard but effective mitigations that you should also invest in. And for the others that can't be easily mitigated, there's always insurance. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions or have Barry lead a discussion. Hi, Barry.
Yes, I am here. I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Eric. That's a good way of looking at many of these things. And I guess the first question that I would pose, we'll see what the other folks around may ask, is where do you start? Do you start with the server policy, with a staff policy? Because all these external things you've mentioned, some of them we can deal with, some of them we can harden the station, some of them, well, if the tornado is going to come through, not much you can do. But what about the living component here?
So you refresh my memory. You mentioned two or three things in your list of examples of things to focus on.
Do you want to start with the policy on the server, or do you want to start with the policy on the staff?
I don't know that I would start with either of them. Neither of those may be important for a particular station. And that, one of the points that I'm trying to make is we have to step back and look at the whole picture. Otherwise, we wind up oftentimes spinning our wheels and putting time into and effort into something that's not the most important thing to address right now.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
So if you have a station that's got an aux transmitter facility to help it stay on the air and has good resilience against critical infrastructure failures and so forth, yeah, then maybe you're going to start looking at issues of how much do we work with our staff and how much do we work with our server infrastructure. But, there are a lot of stations out there that aren't down at that level yet, that have more fundamental things that will put them off the air for lengthy periods of time.
I'm looking here at the YouTube, which seems a little strange. Something happened there. I don't know what it is. Um, but I would have thought that you would say the first thing that you do inside is look at your firewall. Second thing you do is address the issue of uh, account authentication, whether it be changing passwords frequently or multi-factor. And maybe I'm going too far afield here from.
Well, I think you're jumping one step, which is you're talking about solutions, but you haven't identified what the problem is that you're trying to solve and how likely that problem is to occur. I know many places that have very poor password policies and don't require people to change their passwords. And they've had very few problems in terms of IT issues that can be traced to password policies, and far more problems with station functioning due to lack of diversity of internet service providers when they rely on the internet to carry program content to their transmitter site. So it requires some context, and it requires looking at problems first and then looking at solutions once you've decided what the important problems are to solve.
Okay. Anyone have questions? Certainly that situation in Boulder was a good example of what you might want to prepare for as opposed to, the routine run-of-the-mill stuff. Paradise, California, similar situation. Fire.
And that too is totally, context or location dependent. So here in Boulder, we recently did a review to see what kind of major events that represented a risk to the communities in our service area for this station had occurred in the last 15 years. And it was a bit of a surprise to learn that there was a wildfire, a life-threatening wildfire, life-threatening floods, mass shooting events, and other similar community emergencies that occurred on average once a year. So that, and wildfire was the most common of those. So that really changed a lot of priorities when we did that little review. Those situations here are not the same situations that exist in Boston, for example. And so the knock-on effect of that Boston being different in a Boston situation, all the priorities, all those points that you would plot in those 2D matrix graphs will change because the context is different.
Yeah, and of course, if you have a large IT department, it's going to be a whole lot easier to do things than if you're a small station and you are the IT department along with everybody else. I don't know what happened, but apparently YouTube stopped everything. So I had to restart it. I hope we haven't lost too many people.
So there is a question in the chat from Bill that says, with only enough money for one generator, does it go at the main transmitter or at the aux site? And I will say the answer to that question depends. So here are a couple of dependencies. One is the studio able to originate programming through a power failure? Second is the main and aux site far enough apart that they don't suffer power failures at the same time? Third is, do they have equal capability to serve the audience? Or is the aux site a more limited power and limited geographical coverage area? If the aux site is a limited geographical coverage area type of service compared to the main transmitter site, then you're probably going to put the generator out at the main transmitter site so you can best serve your audience through a utility failure. But another station or another location in a group of stations will have completely different considerations.
Well, you want to make sure that the studio has power.
As a start, or that you have the ability to originate programming from the transmitter site specifically, so that you could afford to lose the studio and either stream to the transmitter site from somebody's home or go out to the transmitter site and use the one generator that you have in your whole infrastructure at a place where you can stay on the air.
This harks back to something we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the number of different ways to access your transmitter. It's not just your one phone loop or your STL, but you should have certainly internet link. You should have an RPU backup link, many different ways of getting your audio from one place to another. And then, of course, the most simple right now, especially if you have one of these Nautel boxes, you put a flash drive in the back and you can originate your programming right then and there without having to worry. But you can't tell your audience what's going on. Question came in here, Eric, if risk assessment hasn't really been considered, whom do you suggest should be involved in a discussion to decide priorities?
Well, since risks involve and exist in different parts of the business operations, it would be a discussion amongst people who are involved in those different parts. So it's not just the RF plant or the IT person. There are other risks in a business or in a station that come from other sources, and those people need to be involved, and the people who are going to pay for the solutions also need to be involved.
Would you recommend bringing somebody in?
I don't think it's really that necessary in many cases. When we're, your first pass is looking for low-hanging fruit, and identifying things that could threaten the ability of the station to continue to operate as a going concern, or threaten the ability of the station to continue to air relevant programming content to the audience. Those are things that people in each of these activity groups within the station can readily identify in a first pass. They don't need outside coaching to do that.
Very good point.
And they can readily talk on a qualitative basis as to how often those things are likely to occur and what the impact would be if they do occur, in a sense of, big, small, frequently, not very frequently, and come to a conclusion as to roughly where they rank compared to other risks that have been put on the table by other people.
I've told these stories a couple of times. Two stations. One, the station was in an area that was under construction, and about every third or fourth day, they couldn't turn on their night transmitter because the cables had been cut, and either the phone loop or the program loop or the remote control were non-functional. And it got so bad that I had to rig up a check every afternoon for them to see the little red light on the Mosley. And eventually I finally got the owner of that station to buy a proper STL because the location had to be at the very top of the tower. And it worked very well. The second station was one also out in a relatively new area under construction. And I'd get these really frantic phone calls from the operations manager or the owner because they were off the air. The electric had been cut and backhoe fade took over. And this guy was just, I mean, apoplectic. What do you do? How can I fix this? And I said, well, you could put a generator out there. Well, how much is the generator going to cost? We lost a remote at the such and such car dealership this weekend. And I would prepare the quote and send it off to him. And he chose not to do anything. 3 weeks later, lost another one. And he's screaming again, how come we're off the air? What are we going to do? I said, well, I told you, put a generator in. Well, how much is that going to cost? It was like he had about a 20-second memory. So as you're saying, Eric, you have to have buy-in from the essential parts of the station to identify the problems and prepare for them.
And understand the consequences. I mean, that's a group education process. I think once people understand the consequences, it becomes a lot easier to get their support for addressing things that are more consequential than other things.
Mm-hmm. Any comments, folks?
Otherwise, we can go back to telling stories.
Yeah.
There was a note from Bill. I've never considered smoke fades. Can you talk more about this? Yes. So just from this one example. So this was a wildfire in grasslands. And the smoke content of that was initially grass, but then included other chemicals that were released from burning buildings and businesses, and a Tesla dealership was one of those businesses. So because of the way winds were blowing at the time, smoke transport was carried from the scene of the active fire, which was many, many acres, pretty much horizontal to the ground for a number of miles. And meteorologically in our area, these very high-speed winds are downslope winds that come off the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Under the right conditions, they basically accelerate as they do so. And then when they hit the high plains, they can do so at speeds well in excess of 150 miles an hour in some locations, and where their canyons tend to be places where wind is focused. Those winds will travel 5 or 10 miles horizontally, and then they reach an area which meteorologists call the jump zone, which is where the wind stops, doesn't really travel any further out on the plains, but because the air is hot, it's sucking in air from the opposite direction, and the smoke rises vertically at that point. So if you have a microwave link that's going through any of these areas occupied by smoke, the smoke particles are large enough to scatter and attenuate the signal. And what we experienced, even though the fire was not directly between the studio site and the transmitter site, smoke would go into the microwave beam path and would attenuate the signal enough that we would lose reception at the transmitter site. Fortunately, it wasn't for very long periods of time, but it was a serious wake-up call because those same kinds of buildings and same kind of grasslands existed right on the microwave path, and those smoke clouds would have been much denser, and we would have had much longer term interruptions if we were relying solely on 950 megahertz or 5 gigahertz IP wireless links. So that's led us into a plan for what we call, there's all sorts of diversity in facilities, power diversity and so forth. And we have a term called azimuthal diversity, which is you want signals to arrive at the transmitter site from very different directions, so that if one path gets blocked by smoke, there might be another path for, let's say, a two-way IP link that's not blocked by smoke, that goes off in a different direction and might be relayed by an intermediate device. And so we're working together with some other stations actually to plan out a gigabit per second IT, wireless IT, private wireless IT network infrastructure that has not just redundant routes and redundant hardware, but routes that come into each relay point and each delivery point in the network from very different directions, so as to be tolerant of smoke interference.
Doesn't sound entirely unlike ducting problems that our friends in the Southeast often have to deal with.
Right, and addressed by using different altitudes. Yeah. So did that answer your question, Bill?
Bill, just press your space bar to open your mic.
Or a thumbs up on the video works.
Yep.
No, I got it. Thank you.
Yep. Another question, I'm not sure how to address this, but more often than not, the needs and requirements desired by IT for security mitigate against broadcast continuity. Yeah, and that's an important discussion. There's there are lots of situations where solutions to improving network security are so cumbersome and inconvenient that either they don't get used or people work around them in order to continue to get program content material out on the air. And that, again, is a perspective issue. People who are involved in making decisions about what solutions to risks are to be implemented and what risks are the most important ones to address have to be aware of those things and take that into account. That may mean that a particular mitigation approach that's favored by IT is actually not going to be a very effective one.
That sort of touches on that area there about dealing with staff, doesn't it? Because in some stations, IT is a completely separate silo. In other stations, IT is part of the team. And
in some stations, it's an outside contractor.
And in some stations, it's non-existent.
Yeah.
So each of these things needs to be addressed. You do this audit and you find out, what do you have, what do you need, and how important is it to stay up?
Yeah. And you use the word audit, and so sometimes I find that's a little off-putting to people. There's like this instinct of, oh, we need something very complicated and comprehensive. And many times you don't need something that complicated, and you certainly don't need something comprehensive. You need to sit down and identify which risks are the most important ones to address now, given the current state of affairs and these goals that I mentioned earlier. But it doesn't have to be a comprehensive list, and it doesn't have to deal with the whole scope of things that you might do over the course of 5 years. It might be, what are we going to do this calendar quarter, and what's the most important thing to start working on? And you go step by step, mitigating risks at the station, or saying, well, we can't solve for this, and we're going to buy we're either going to take our lumps when they occur, or maybe we'll have business interruption insurance that has appropriate terms or some other provision for it.
Goes back to the phrase, first things first.
Yeah, but you got to get people to agree as to what's first.
Exactly.
And these are tools to do it that are not specialist tools.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting that you could have talked to us about 4 or 5 different software packages and apps to load in different things, people, equipment, but really it's looking at the overall operation first and then making decisions as to how to deal with them. I think it's a wise way to go.
So there's a comment here that says, back in the 90s, I worked for a TV station that was delayed by the permitting process from getting a studio generator. During an outage, we ran 150 feet of extension cords and powered up critical equipment, STL, remote controls, and a few other things. And, to me, that's brilliant. I mean, we, as engineers, often think about quick workarounds like that, but that's also, an example of a risk has been identified and a solution that's relatively quick, relatively low cost, and relatively easy to implement is put in place for a while until something more permanent can be established. And, that may be the thing that you do actually for quite a while, because it may be that that's good enough for peeling one layer off the onion of risks in the organization. And then there are a few other things that you go on to address with your time and resources next before you come back in this case and get the studio generator permitted and go on from there.
It was very inventive and very smart, and it
And
solved.
it points out that, interim solutions are often just as effective as, the permanent solution.
Yeah. Of course, they don't want that 150 feet of extension cords laying around for weeks on end, because sure as shooting, someone will trip over it and go boom.
Yeah, but you could, it may be the situation that most power failures in that location are relatively short, matter of hours. Um, and
Clean up afterwards. Here's another
exactly.
van.
Right. Doesn't that extension cord doesn't have to live there permanently on the staircase as a trip hazard.
Mhm. Here's one where another van where they use the generator to power the news workstations and edit bays. It kind of goes back to one of your factors of what you have to look at is how often do you see a power outage? There are substations that have power coming from 2 different directions. In some places, Brian says the long extension cord would just go missing.
Then
And you're back off the air, Brian.
you put it in a cabinet next to the fire extinguisher with a lock on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
In case of power outage, break glass.
Well, if you have lots of extensive power outages, it probably makes some sense to pre-position a wire from downstairs upstairs. Of course, you need a switch to make sure that you aren't feeding power in when the power comes back on.
Yeah, but if it's an APU in a rack and you're just unplugging it from its main source and plugging it into the extension cord.
That's a very good reason to have an APU.
And APUs are cheap.
So why don't all stations have them? You don't have to answer
Ask that question about a lot of human decisions.
It's because they're cheap.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, if your solution is let's run an extension cord and power up these devices and we have to spend $60 on an APU and $50 on a long enough, heavy, and large enough wire size extension cord to get the job done. Okay, you now know what the cost is.
Mhm. I was surprised to learn that in certain areas, if you have solar power and the local utility goes out, they prevent you from switching the solar power into your studio or house or whatever. I guess presumably for that reason, that you want to avoid an explosion when the power comes back on. But you would think,
Yeah, or electrifying somebody who's working on the lines outside.
Mhm.
Um, there is a question of what an APU is, and I think the acronym comes from auxiliary power unit, but it's like the 1U thing in the rack that has 8 outlets and a power cord coming out of it that either gets hardwired or plugged into some other power source. So it's not necessarily a battery backup UPS.
I know some stations will put as big a battery section in as they can to operate everything for as long as 12 hours.
Sure. And that's their risk assessment, that utility outages that are longer than 12 hours are sufficiently rare that we don't have to invest in anything else,
Mhm.
given the cost and effort that will take our lumps.
Similar power supply, solar power could drive a 300-watt transmitter as a emergency source.
And again, it's like, what's the cost and level of effort for that versus other things that could disrupt your service?
Mhm. I've heard from some people who operate off of these transmitter sites that have been sold to some of these large operators. I won't make any names, but sometimes the generators are not kept up, and the next thing you know, you're off the air and no way to power yourself. So that goes back to the discussion, not only of the risk factor, but whether the solution as presented by your landlord is sufficient.
It seems no matter how well you plan, things still happen. I remember one time I got a call in the morning from the KFI studio. Hey, we're off the air. And a quick conversation with him revealed that the audio console was dead, had no power. And I couldn't get any better information from the board operator to tell him anything to do. So I jumped in the car and drove down there and get in to make a couple of quick checks. And the weirdest thing had happened. We had a power strip. I think it was a Weber, W-A-B-E-R, Weber brand, that it had failed. And so I quickly grabbed an extension cord and plugged into another outlet, because it was plugged to an outlet that was backed up by the generator, but the generator didn't come on because the failure was in this power distribution thing. And I opened it up later in the shop and found out that when Weber fabricated that, they only used crimping in there. They didn't solder anything. And that caused a failure that shut down the whole radio station. And this is right next to the console. So any other backup power you have is not going to be able to get around that. So anyway, I soldered all the connections in that power strip and put it back together, and it never failed again.
Well, that's sort of doing the work that the company should have done in the first place, but yeah.
That surprised me too. I thought that they just relied on crimping the way they did. I didn't think that was very good. I was disappointed to see that. But if they'd have soldered all those, that'd have never been a problem. But I guess for economics, they don't bother soldering them.
Well, Eric's got to run, so we're definitely going to say thank you, Eric, for having been with us, and appreciate the information and lay it out. And so let's move on.